Edward Mitchell, a 29-year-old at the time, could never have imagined that his daily routine at the National Archives would change his life so drastically. He was responsible for digitizing historical documents, a task that offered little excitement. However, on what seemed like an ordinary day, he came across a peculiar manuscript dated from the Civil War era and signed by Abraham Lincoln. This manuscript not only seemed out of place but also contained unimaginable content. The manuscript wasn't about politics or the usual military strategies of the time. On the contrary, Lincoln revealed something that history books never taught. He described a hidden threat, far more dangerous than the Confederate armies. This threat was the existence of supernatural creatures, specifically werewolves, who were helping the Confederacy destabilize the Union forces. At first, Edward thought it was a mistake, or perhaps an old piece of fiction, maybe an ancient attempt at historical romance. However, as he read through the manuscript, Lincoln's narrative became increasingly real and terrifying. The President of the United States not only acknowledged the existence of these creatures, but was also secretly leading a network to hunt them. The content of the manuscript was disturbing. Lincoln was not only facing a nation divided, he was also leading a secret war against monsters. The lycanthropes, known as shadow spies, infiltrated the Union ranks, sabotaging military operations, assassinating officers, and spreading chaos during battles. This secret was something the U.S. government clearly didn't want anyone to know. For Edward, the discovery of that manuscript condemned him to a life of paranoia and flight. From the moment his eyes fell upon Lincoln's words, he knew his life was in danger, for the government would do whatever it took to keep that truth buried. With no time to fully process everything he had read, Edward realized his life would never be the same. What was supposed to be just another tedious day at the National Archives became the beginning of a journey filled with terror and pursuit. Lincoln's manuscript was a key to a conspiracy that would transcend generations. The manuscript Edward discovered was not just a historical piece, it was a window into the darker side of the American Civil War. In it, Lincoln described how the Confederacy, in its desperation to win the war, had made a pact with supernatural beings. Among these creatures, the most feared were the lycanthropes, capable of disguising themselves as humans and transforming into powerful beasts. These werewolves were more than just savage monsters. They were trained spies and lethal soldiers operating in the shadows. Their ability to blend in with humans allowed them to remain unnoticed for a long time. Lincoln detailed the brutal attacks these creatures carried out against Union forces, destabilizing the army and spreading panic among the soldiers. These werewolves were not simple beasts. They had intelligence and organization. Lincoln believed that some Confederate leaders were closely allied with these creatures, using them for their most dangerous missions. These monsters had the ability to assassinate key figures, destroy vital supplies, and even dismantle entire military operations. The werewolves' tactics were meticulously planned. They knew where to strike, when to ambush, and how to disorient enemy troops. Lincoln described in his manuscript that the losses caused by these attacks were often attributed to human saboteurs, when in reality, they were the work of these supernatural creatures. The most disturbing aspect was that the Confederacy, under the leadership of Jefferson Davis, was not only aware of the existence of these creatures, but was actively using them. The pact between Confederate leaders and the werewolves represented an alliance as dark as it was desperate. For Davis, any means that led to victory was valid, even if it meant aligning with monsters. For Lincoln, the revelation that he was fighting not only men but also supernatural beings profoundly altered the way he saw the war. He realized that he had to not only triumph on the battlefield, but also protect the nation from a hidden threat that could destroy everything he knew. With the discovery of the werewolves and their alliance with the Confederacy, Lincoln knew he had to do more than just lead the country in a traditional civil war. Secretly, he organized a network of monster hunters, composed of trusted men, to help him combat this supernatural threat that haunted the nation. These hunters were handpicked. Many were war veterans who had witnessed inexplicable things on the battlefield. Others had prior knowledge of supernatural phenomena. Lincoln knew that this war, like politics, required stealth tactics and a specialized group to deal with the creatures lurking in the shadows. Lincoln personally led some of these patrols, especially on the most crucial and secret missions. He was not only a political leader, but also a warrior, determined to eradicate the supernatural threat that endangered the Union. The battles he fought in the secret tunnels of Washington, under the city's darkness, were described with terrifying intensity in the manuscript. In one of these missions, Lincoln and his men descended into the tunnels connecting the White House to various strategic points in the Capitol. There, they encountered werewolves using the underground corridors as a base of operations to infiltrate Washington. These creatures, fast and relentless, ambushed Lincoln and his group in fierce and bloody attacks. The president was not just a distant leader, he was on the front lines, fighting alongside his men against the supernatural horrors. In one of these battles, Lincoln faced a werewolf directly, who nearly killed him before his men intervened and saved him. The fight left Lincoln with both physical and emotional scars that he would carry for the rest of his life. With each mission, Lincoln knew that the war he was leading was far more complex than anyone could imagine. He was not just fighting to preserve the Union, but also to protect his people from forces they didn't even know existed. The burden of this secret consumed him, and he knew that if he failed, the consequences would be catastrophic for the nation's future. The discovery of the werewolves revealed a threat far greater than Lincoln or anyone else could have imagined. The Confederacy was not merely fighting for its political independence. They were willing to sacrifice humanity itself to gain power. Lincoln wrote in his manuscript that the Confederacy was involved in something far deeper and more sinister. The creatures the Confederacy used were not just supernatural soldiers. They were part of an ancient, dark pact, where supernatural forces joined men to achieve their political and military objectives. Lincoln began to realize that the Civil War he was fighting was not just about freedom and slavery, but also about controlling forces beyond human comprehension. Lincoln's investigations led him to discover that these pacts with werewolves were just the tip of the iceberg. There were reports of other creatures roaming the battlefields, silent and deadly, following orders from Confederate leaders. Some of these creatures moved like shadows, disappearing into the darkness before any soldier could notice their presence. Lincoln feared that if the Confederacy won the war with the help of these supernatural forces, there would be no hope for the country. The nation would be at the mercy of monsters that, once unleashed, could turn against anyone, including their own allies. It was a battle for the soul of America, and Lincoln was at the center of this fight. The Union, on the other hand, was at a disadvantage. While Lincoln and his hunters fought the lurking creatures, the traditional army fought human soldiers. There was a barrier between what the public knew and what was really happening behind the scenes of the war. Lincoln's manuscript indicated that this hidden truth was known only to a small circle of trusted men. The battle against this supernatural threat would not end with the Civil War. Even if the Union emerged victorious on the battlefield, these dark forces would continue to haunt the country. Lincoln knew that, regardless of the war's outcome, the supernatural world would always be present, waiting for the next opportunity to emerge from the shadows. After discovering the manuscript, Edward Mitchell quickly became a marked man. He knew that what he had read in the National Archives put him in great danger. The truth revealed about Lincoln and the werewolves was something the U.S. government would not allow to come to light, and Edward soon realized his life would never be the same. In the days that followed, Edward began noticing signs that he was being watched. First, there was the black car that constantly appeared near his house, parked in a shadow, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. There was never anyone visible inside the car, but its presence was constant and threatening. Then the phone calls started. They came at any time of the day or night, but always with the same pattern. Edward would answer the phone, but on the other end, there was only a deep silence. It was as if the silence itself was a warning that he was being closely observed. With each phone ring, the fear grew. Rebecca, his friend and confidant, also began noticing similar signs. She too was followed by the black car and received the same silent calls. Both knew that the government or some dark force was trying to silence them before they could share what they had discovered. The terror grew with the feeling that at every step, something or someone was lurking. The events escalated when Rebecca mysteriously disappeared. She had undoubtedly been captured, but Edward didn't know who had taken his friend or where she was. This led him to make a drastic decision: to flee. Knowing his life was at risk, Edward abandoned everything he knew and fled the United States, seeking refuge in a distant country. Mexico seemed like the safest place to disappear. Edward thought that in the vast desert landscapes and small communities, he could finally escape the government's clutches. However, the fear followed him. Even in exile, he couldn't shake off the shadows that pursued him. As Edward fled, he continued to uncover more about the dark network chasing him. He discovered that he was not just running from a regular government, but from a secret organization known as the Department of Supernatural Anomalies. This department had a single mission: to cover up and eliminate any supernatural threat that arose in the United States, ensuring that the public would never know the true nature of the events that shaped the country's history. Sebastian Lang, the department's director, was an enigmatic and feared figure. Little was known about him, but what Edward uncovered was enough to heighten his fear. Lang was not just a government agent, he was one of the main people responsible for silencing those who got too close to the truth. Anyone who dared investigate the supernatural activities covered up by the government, like Edward and Rebecca, was considered a national security threat. Edward found classified documents that mentioned Lang as being the architect of numerous secret operations involving supernatural beings. He and his agents were relentless, mercilessly eliminating any evidence of unexplainable phenomena. Edward learned that the department had done everything possible to ensure that reports of lycanthropes, ghosts, and other creatures were removed from historical records, replacing them with more acceptable versions of events. The creation of the Department of Supernatural Anomalies had deep roots. It dated back to the years immediately following the Civil War, when Lincoln and his monster hunters began dealing with the supernatural threats that continued to haunt the country. After Lincoln's death, the government realized that these threats would not disappear with the Union's victory, and that's when the department was secretly founded to continue protecting the country from the shadows. Sebastian Lang, after taking control of the department, transformed the organization into a cover-up machine. To him, national security was non-negotiable, and anyone who threatened to expose the country's supernatural past needed to be neutralized. Now, Edward knew that Lang was directly involved in pursuing him and Rebecca, and this only deepened the archivist's despair. Edward understood that the department was the real power behind the attempts to silence him. Lang wouldn't rest until Edward was silenced once and for all. The constant fear of being captured and the loss of Rebecca fueled his paranoia, making him question every move, every sound, and every shadow he saw. Edward's paranoia grew each day. Even in a foreign country, he knew he wasn't safe. The black car continued to appear outside his new house in Mexico. At first, Edward tried to believe it was a coincidence, but the frequency with which the vehicle showed up, always parked in the same spot, made him realize he was constantly being watched. Edward's nights became long and sleepless. He could barely sleep, convinced that at any moment, Lang or his agents would show up to take him away. Every noise at night, every silent phone call, fueled the terror that consumed him. He knew that, even far from the U.S., the reach of the Department of Supernatural Anomalies was vast and relentless. Edward began seeing threats wherever he went. Every new person he met, every stranger who passed by his house, seemed to be observing his every move. What was once a small, peaceful town in Mexico now felt like a surveillance field, with hidden spies on every corner. He stopped frequenting public places, convinced that it would be harder for Lang to locate him if he stayed in constant motion. Despite his isolation, Edward couldn't shake the terror of the phone calls. They came at increasingly frequent intervals, usually in the middle of the night. When he answered, he encountered the same deafening silence on the other end. Although no one spoke, Edward could feel the presence of someone, or something, on the other side, as if he was being monitored by invisible eyes. Over time, his mind began to fray. The constant state of alert affected his reasoning, and he began to doubt his own sanity. Was he really being watched, or was the fear making him see things that weren't there? But the signs were undeniable. The black car, the calls, Rebecca's disappearance, all pointed to the fact that he was on the radar of a force much greater than he could understand. In his solitude, Edward began documenting his experiences, fearing that if he were captured or killed, his story would disappear with him. He wrote frantically, trying to leave a legacy of his discovery. Lincoln's manuscript could not be buried again, and Edward was determined to expose the truth, even if it cost him his life. The final confrontation between Edward and Sebastian Lang was inevitable. Lang was patient, but Edward knew that the director of the Department of Supernatural Anomalies would find him. And that's exactly what happened on a cold night when Lang finally appeared at Edward's door. The heavy air of tension filled the small room as Lang entered, accompanied by two of his agents. Lang was a man of cold, controlled appearance. He didn't display anger or hatred, but his presence exuded an unshakable authority. With a calculating gaze, he observed Edward, who was cornered. The time for running had ended, and Edward knew there would be no escape this time. "You've uncovered secrets that should never have been unearthed, Edward," Lang said calmly. "Lincoln did what had to be done to protect this country, and we continue his work. But you, in trying to expose what he hid, have become a threat." Lang continued explaining that the department existed to ensure that supernatural chaos didn't destroy the country. To him, the truth about the lycanthropes and other supernatural phenomena needed to remain buried. Revealing these secrets to the world would only bring panic and destruction, and Lang was determined to prevent that at all costs. Lang's presence was almost suffocating, and Edward felt powerless. He tried to argue, explaining that the world had a right to know the truth, but Lang remained unmoved. To him, the greater good always justified his actions. The department director had silenced many others before Edward, and this would be just another obstacle to be removed. Rebecca had been captured weeks earlier, and Edward knew the same fate awaited him. Lang's agents, always present and relentless, moved to surround Edward. He knew the end was near, but in a stroke of luck, he managed to escape through an open window, running through the narrow streets of the city like a desperate man. He knew Lang wouldn't stop until he found him again. Lincoln's manuscript didn't just recount the war on traditional battle lines. One of the most terrifying moments described was the discovery of a network of underground tunnels beneath the White House. These tunnels, initially built as escape routes in case of emergency, had become a secret battlefield between Lincoln and the supernatural creatures. The lycanthropes, as Lincoln reported, used these tunnels to infiltrate the Capitol and carry out stealth attacks. The manuscript's descriptions told of sleepless nights in which Lincoln led small groups of hunters through the dark tunnels, facing the werewolves in bloody ambushes. The creatures were stealthy and knew the terrain well, making each incursion a deadly challenge. These underground battles were never recorded in historical annals, but Lincoln documented each one in detail in the manuscript. The lycanthropes used the tunnels as their operations bases, attacking and disappearing into the shadows before Union forces could react. Lincoln knew that if the werewolves managed to establish a firm base under the Capitol, they could destabilize the government from within. The most brutal encounter described occurred when Lincoln and his elite group were ambushed by a pack of werewolves more ferocious than any they had faced before. The battle was intense, with the wolves attacking with a ferocity that even the most experienced hunters found surprising. Several men fell, but Lincoln, with relentless courage, fought with everything he had, wielding his silver bayonet. In the end, the hunters managed to repel the attack, but not without great losses. Lincoln, wounded and exhausted, looked at the bodies of his men and knew that this war was unlike any other he or the country had ever faced. With each victory, he felt that he was only delaying the inevitable, a final battle that could cost everything. The tunnels remained a constant concern for Lincoln. He knew that the werewolves wouldn't easily give up their attempt to take the Capitol. Even as he led the country through the Civil War, Lincoln continued his night patrols, always on alert, waiting for the next attack from the creatures lurking in the city's depths. One of the most dramatic events recorded in Lincoln's manuscript involved an assassination attempt while he was traveling by train for a secret meeting with his generals. It was a dark and stormy night, and the president was accompanied by a small group of bodyguards. The train sped through the countryside when suddenly it was ambushed. Lincoln had already suspected that the Confederacy was using supernatural forces to sabotage the Union, but he wasn't prepared for the brutality of the attack that followed. Lycanthropes, the same creatures he had faced in the tunnels under Washington, leaped onto the moving train's cars, their sharp claws tearing through the wood as if it were paper. The werewolves attacked with indescribable ferocity, killing several of Lincoln's bodyguards within seconds. The battle that unfolded in the train's narrow corridors was a nightmare of blood and chaos. Lincoln, armed with his bayonet, fought alongside his soldiers, defending himself from the creature's claws and fangs. The fight inside the train was tense and desperate. With limited space, Lincoln's men had to fight in close combat, where every movement was a matter of life and death. The lycanthropes, agile and powerful, advanced mercilessly, destroying everything in their path. Lincoln, with his unwavering determination, resisted, even when hope seemed lost. The situation seemed unsustainable, but the Union soldiers, inspired by Lincoln's courage, finally managed to turn the tide of the battle. After a long and painful fight, the werewolves were killed, but not without leaving a deep mark. Lincoln was shocked by the brutality of the attack, realizing that the Confederacy was willing to use any means necessary to eliminate him and win the war. By dawn, the train finally reached its destination, but Lincoln knew that the attack had been more than just an assassination attempt. The Confederacy, through its pacts with the lycanthropes, had made it clear that this war was not just between men, but between supernatural forces. Each battle faced only heightened the gravity of the situation Lincoln and his group of hunters were confronting. The episode on the train showed Lincoln that his fight against the lycanthropes was not just a matter of defense. He needed to go on the offensive and destroy these creatures once and for all. But in doing so, he knew he would be facing a dark alliance that could consume the entire country, if not contained. After his desperate escape, Edward found refuge in a small, remote village in Mexico. The region was isolated, with its dirt roads and simple buildings, far from modern life and any apparent threat. He believed that here, far from the United States and Lang's reach, he could finally find peace. In the first few months, Edward tried to adapt to his new life. The local villagers left him alone, respecting his desire for isolation. He built a simple routine, living modestly in a small house. The village's quiet life almost made him believe he was safe from the clutches of the Department of Supernatural Anomalies. But the fear never left him. Edward knew that no matter how remote the village, Lang and his agents had the resources to find him. The first sign that his tranquility was threatened came with the reappearance of the black car. The same sense of being watched that had tormented him in the U.S. returned with full force. He spotted the car for the first time on a quiet afternoon. It was parked in the shadow of a tree, discreetly distant from his house. No one inside the vehicle moved or made any motion. Edward tried to ignore it, but the feeling of dread returned with full force. He knew it was only a matter of time before Lang found him. The nights became restless again. The phone calls returned, with the same silent pattern on the other end of the line. Edward began obsessively locking doors and windows, but nothing seemed enough to keep the invisible threat at bay. He knew he was being watched, but he had nowhere to run. His years of fleeing and exile in Mexico had worn him down deeply. His physical and mental health began to deteriorate, but the fear remained ever present. He continued to write frantically, hoping that if something happened to him, someone would find his accounts and share them with the world. But deep down, Edward knew his time was running out. Now 80 years old, Edward knew he could no longer run. His health was frail, his body tired, and his mind crumbling after 5 decades of flight and paranoia. The constant presence of the black car and the silent calls were a reminder that Lang and his agents had never lost sight of him. He was cornered, and the only thing left was the inevitability of his end. Every night was a torment for Edward. He knew that the day of the final confrontation was approaching, and that soon Lang would come to silence him for good. The guilt of leaving Rebecca behind still haunted him, as did the constant fear that the truth he had discovered would die with him. Even now, so close to the end, he felt he had failed in his mission. Lincoln's manuscript remained by Edward's side, a testament to a hidden history he had never been able to share with the world. Over the years, he had tried to find ways to expose the truth, but all his efforts were thwarted. He knew the Department of Supernatural Anomalies would ensure that this truth remained buried forever. The clock on his wall neared midnight when he heard the soft knocks on his door. Edward wasn't surprised. He knew they would come. He rose from his chair with difficulty, his legs trembling under the weight of age and accumulated terror. He walked slowly to the door, feeling a strange calm wash over him. When he opened the door, he met no resistance. He knew his time had run out. Lang had finally found him, and Edward accepted the end with resignation. He looked at the black car, still parked in the darkness, and for a moment thought of all the lives that had been sacrificed to protect a secret that should never have existed. When the door opened fully, the cycle of his escape came to an end. Edward knew his story would be erased, but the terror he had uncovered in 1971 about Lincoln and the supernatural war would continue to haunt the shadows of power.